The atmosphere inside the congressional hearing room was suffocatingly tense, the kind of heavy, electrified silence that precedes a political detonation on live television broadcast to millions of constituents across the country. Representative Ilhan Omar looked directly into the face of Secretary of State Marco Rubio and unequivocally branded him as AIPAC's delivery boy. It was a calculated, brutal insult delivered in front of the entire nation, aimed precisely at the son of Cuban refugees, a man whose own mother had spent her life cleaning hotel rooms. She launched this verbal strike at the son of a maid, waiting for the explosive reaction that the cameras craved. Yet the secretary did not raise his voice by a single decibel. Instead, he simply opened a plain folder sitting on the dais before him, preparing to read back to her 3 specific things she had publicly stated, and one crucial thing she had desperately tried to delete, sparking a sequence of events that would leave her utterly speechless and conspicuously absent from any media interviews since. Before the secretary could even begin his systematic dismantling, Omar seized the floor, declaring her intent to address the true nature of the hearing itself. She sat with her back immaculately straight, her chin tilted at that highly specific, camera-ready angle, the practiced, precise geometry of a woman who has been photographed enough times to understand intimately that physical composure communicates unyielding innocence. Her hijab was flawlessly adjusted, without a single fold out of place, and her hands rested on the polished wood of the table at perfectly equal distances from the microphone. They were not merely resting, nor were they simply placed. They were arranged in the exact manner one arranges a curated display, meant exclusively to be admired but never touched. With absolute conviction, she proclaimed that the hearing had absolutely nothing to do with combating anti-Semitism, but was instead a blatant exercise in silencing a Muslim woman who dared to criticize the state of Israel. She framed the entire proceeding as transparent political theater, arguing that the fact the highest-ranking diplomat in the country chose to weaponize his office for this spectacle revealed everything the public needed to know about his compromised priorities. When she turned her gaze directly onto Rubio, the movement possessed the deliberate, lethal quality of a sniper aiming a weapon they had spent all morning meticulously loading. She sharply reminded the room that the secretary sits comfortably in his chair speaking abstractly about refugees, before launching into her own visceral history. She demanded he listen to what a real refugee experience entailed, recounting the 4 grueling years she survived in a refugee camp, drinking contaminated water that left her brother violently ill, and sleeping on a cold concrete floor in a room completely devoid of doors. She weaponized his own heritage against him, noting that his parents fled Cuba, a regime that genuinely oppresses its citizens, while he hypocritically sat before Congress defending a foreign government that, in her words, inflicts the exact same systemic oppression upon the Palestinians. The biting irony, she noted with dripping condescension, was not lost on a single soul in the room, except, apparently, the secretary himself. She allowed a pause to settle over the chamber, not to catch her breath, but to perfect her aim, embodying the lethal stillness of an archer pulling back a bowstring just moments before release. She demanded brutal honesty about his true motivations, explicitly accusing him of not losing a moment of sleep, agonizing over the safety of Jewish communities, but rather appearing at the hearing solely because AIPAC had commanded it. She targeted the financial bedrock of his political career, explicitly naming the donors who bankrolled his Senate races and his spectacularly short-lived presidential campaign, the one she mockingly noted lasted a mere 3 months. Her voice suddenly found a jagged, sharpened edge, the tone of a predator whose target is firmly locked. She called him their delivery boy, allowing the derogatory label to hang in the sterile air before violently expanding upon the metaphor. painting a vivid, humiliating portrait. He carries the packages, he rings the bell, and he obediently collects the tip. That, she declared with absolute finality, is what he does, what he has always done, and what every single political operative in Washington intimately knows to be true. The smile that graced her face immediately following that sentence was small, curved, and deeply private, the satisfied smirk of a combatant who believes her profound cruelty is fully justified and intends to savor every drop of it. Acknowledging his mother's past, she claimed to respect that she cleaned hotel rooms, aggressively contrasting it with her own mother who swept floors in a foreign, unforgiving country. But critically, never swept floors for a political lobby. Tilting her head a quarter of an inch in a predatory recalibration, she challenged him to look inward and consider if he could honestly claim the same moral high ground. Just behind her, a staffer made a small, smug adjustment to the angle of a binder on the table, radiating the premature satisfaction of a team that believed they had just decisively won the room and were already drafting the victorious social media posts. Marco Rubio, however, did not flinch, did not retreat, and absolutely did not break his composure. He sat anchored to his chair, his sleeves practically rolled to mid-forearm, both hands planted completely flat against the table, palms pressing down. The absolute, unshakable stillness of his hands contrasted so violently with the visceral cruelty of her accusations that the front-row press cameras frantically documented the physical standoff, capturing a depth of tension that the sterile official transcripts could never convey. His jaw was locked, not with the explosive tension of a politician preparing to shout, but with the immense, trembling restraint of a man actively holding something dangerous back, bracing himself, the way one holds a heavy door against a violent, howling wind that desperately wants to blow it wide open. It was an effort of supreme control because the devastating reality waiting behind that door was not quite ready to be unleashed into the room. He let the agonizing silence stretch for 4, then 5 agonizing seconds. When he finally looked at her, it was not the performative gaze of a politician preparing to deliver a rehearsed monologue. It was the heavy, calculating stare of a man making a real-time decision about exactly how much of his own soul he was willing to expose on the congressional record. When he finally spoke, his voice was chillingly quiet, dropping far below the standard booming Rubio baritone that had commanded Senate chambers, dominated national debate stages, and echoed across cable news networks for 2 solid decades. This was a profoundly different voice, an underlying resonance pulled directly from a modest kitchen in West Miami, a place where his parents spoke rapid-fire Spanish, and the monthly electricity bill literally dictated whether the lights could remain on past 9 o'clock. He calmly stated the indisputable fact of the moment. She had just humiliated him on national television, calling him a delivery boy in full view of his own children who were watching the broadcast at home. He let that raw, unadorned sentence sit isolated in the suffocating quiet of the room, offering zero explanations and no immediate follow-up, deploying the rhetorical equivalent of placing a single, heartbreaking photograph on a completely empty table and allowing the vast, undeniable emptiness surrounding it to make the entire argument. He then spoke of his mother, the very woman Omar had just weaponized, detailing how she scrubbed toilets, made beds, and hauled massive armloads of heavy towels down the endless corridors of the Rooney Plaza in Miami Beach for 11 grueling years, serving wealthy guests who never once bothered to learn her name, let alone acknowledge her humanity. He spoke of his father, Mario, who poured drinks behind a bustling bar at that exact same hotel, serving oblivious men who casually tipped him in loose coins and patronizingly called him Buddy simply because they could not be bothered to learn his actual name. He painted the stark picture of their 1,956 arrival in the United States from Cuba, carrying nothing but a single shared suitcase between them, emphasizing with diamond-hard clarity that they labored relentlessly, not for a shadowy lobby, not for a wealthy political donor, and certainly not for a PAC. They bled and sweat entirely for their children, sacrificing their own bodies so that their son might one day sit in a chair of real consequence. They absolutely did not endure a lifetime of backbreaking servitude just so their son could sit in the halls of Congress and be publicly degraded as a delivery boy by a woman who had spent the last 6 years systematically smearing every single person who dared to disagree with her as either a blatant racist, a hateful bigot, or a spineless puppet. With the atmosphere in the room thick enough to cut, Rubio finally, unhurriedly, opened the folder. His movements possessed the deliberate, terrifying speed of a man who genuinely had something catastrophic to deliver and had chosen to interpret her insult with lethal literalism. He explicitly refused to make the hearing about his personal history, boldly pivoting the focus entirely onto her. The hearing, he declared with surgical precision, was fundamentally about her own publicly documented words, spoken on the official record and published under her own name. If she wanted to brand him AIPAC's delivery boy, he accepted the premise with a chilling fine, instantly pulling the first stark white page from his folder, promising to deliver something she could not escape. 1,000 miles away, in a cramped one-bedroom apartment situated directly above a noisy dry cleaner on Nicollet Avenue in Minneapolis, smack in the heart of the 5th Congressional District of Minnesota, Ilhan Omar's own jurisdiction, a 67-year-old Jewish woman named Rachel Abramson sat perched on the absolute edge of her worn sofa, anxiously cranking up the volume on her television set. Rachel was the cornerstone of her community, having proudly owned a small, modest alteration shop just 3 blocks from her apartment for 22 years. She spent her days hemming pants, taking in dresses, and painstakingly replacing broken zippers for a vibrant neighborhood where she knew almost everyone on a first-name basis, including loyal clients who had been bringing garments to her since their grown children were small enough to need their tiny school uniforms tailored. But Rachel's world had fractured in February 2019, the very week following Omar's infamous Benjamin's tweet, when an unknown vandal aggressively spray-painted a massive Star of David, violently slashed through with a thick red line squarely across the front display window of her beloved shop. The local police had eventually arrived and dutifully filed a sterile report, but absolutely nobody was ever arrested. A weary maintenance man from the building management company had scrubbed the shattered glass clean the very next morning, armed with nothing but a harsh bottle of chemical solvent and a dirty rag. He never bothered to ask what the hateful symbol signified, and Rachel, harboring the deep generational exhaustion forged by 67 years of navigating life as a Jewish woman in America, chose not to explain it. She knew intimately that explaining the creeping terror of that symbol to people who fundamentally fail to recognize it is profoundly exhausting, while attempting to explain it to those who already understand it is completely unnecessary. She was glued to the congressional hearing that night because Ilhan Omar was technically her elected representative in Washington, not by any personal ideological choice, but dictated strictly by the cold, unfeeling geography of her zip code. Whispering to herself as she rested her trembling hands heavily upon her knees, Rachel waited to see if anyone would finally hold her representative accountable. Back in Washington, Rubio began to read from the first printed page, his voice adopting the flat, clinical, and devastatingly specific cadence of a seasoned prosecutor reading a damning charge sheet in a crowded courtroom. He recited the date, the 10th of February, 2019, and read her exact social media post. "It's all about the Benjamins, baby." He meticulously unpacked the context, noting that she was allegedly explaining why sovereign members of Congress choose to support the state of Israel, and the specific mechanism she elected to use for that explanation was a crude, direct reference to money, specifically to $100 bills deliberately embedded within a sentence explicitly regarding Jewish people. Omar's defensive response was lightning fast, highly rehearsed, thoroughly polished, and seamlessly deployed from a mental shelf where it had been gathering dust since the very day she realized it would eventually be required. Her hands remained rigidly symmetrical, the immaculate arrangement of her posture completely intact. She sharply argued that she was merely criticizing AIPAC, framing it strictly as a lobbying organization, and insisted there was a distinct, well-established, and highly protected difference between offering legitimate criticism of a political lobby and engaging in vile anti-Semitism. She weaponized her tone, expressing a deeply condescending hope that a man occupying the highest diplomatic office in the free world possessed the intellectual capacity to distinguish between the two. Rubio did not take the bait. He did not contest her defense, nor did he waste a single second arguing the nuance. He simply, methodically, turned to the second page in his folder. He stated the year 2012 and read her exact words. Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them see the evil doings of Israel. For the first time all morning, Omar's right hand abandoned its fiercely guarded, symmetrical position, drifting nervously to the sharp edge of the wooden table, pressing firmly against the grain, the instinctive, involuntary gesture of a person desperately reaching for a solid wall in a room that has suddenly, terrifyingly plunged into darkness. She stammered out her defense, claiming she was strictly discussing a highly specific military operation in Gaza, and that offering criticism of military action is fundamentally not anti-Semitic. However, before she could complete her thought, on the 27th of February, 2019, Rubio decisively cut her off. The interruption was not born of rudeness or lack of decorum. It was dictated by the aggressive pace of a prosecutor who recognizes with absolute certainty that the opponent's defenses are rapidly crumbling, and the sheer momentum of the geopolitical narrative now belongs entirely to him. He confronted her with her public assertion that it is somehow acceptable for individuals to push for allegiance to a foreign country, the insidious dual loyalty accusation. He explicitly defined it on the record as the toxic charge that Jewish Americans secretly serve the interests of Israel before their own homeland, identifying it as one of the oldest, most dangerous anti-Semitic tropes in human existence. At that exact moment, Omar's chin involuntarily dropped a mere quarter of an inch before snapping back up into position, a microscopic flinch, her physical body momentarily betraying the ironclad facade her face was so desperately struggling to maintain. It was the exact type of minute, devastating physical tell that a high-definition camera catches instantly, but a printed transcript will never record. She weakly protested that she was merely criticizing the societal expectation of allegiance and that she should not be subjected to such expectations. Ignoring her floundering, the secretary deliberately laid the three stark white printouts side by side on the polished table. 3 white rectangles, 3 specific dates, 3 damning sentences. He slowly repeated the core toxic themes: hypnotized, Benjamin's, allegiance to a foreign country. He methodically built the undeniable architecture of her rhetoric. 3 distinct statements, spanning 3 separate years, representing 3 uniquely camouflaged versions of the exact same ancient conspiracy theory, the insidious idea that Jews secretly control the world through dark money, through supernatural hypnosis, and through clandestine, treasonous loyalty to a foreign government. He calmly folded his hands together. He conceded, with surgical rhetorical grace, that one of these statements, standing in complete isolation, could perhaps be graciously dismissed as a remarkably poor choice of words. two of them, standing together, might incredibly be brushed off as a bizarre, unfortunate coincidence. But as he locked eyes with her, his gaze carried the immense, crushing patience of a man who had navigated the treacherous waters of constitutional law and cutthroat politics long enough to understand a fundamental truth of human behavior: patterns only announce themselves to those who are genuinely willing to count. 3, he declared with absolute, ringing finality, is a pattern. And patterns, he reminded the Congresswoman, are never accidents. Hundreds of miles away in Minneapolis, Rachel Abramson heard the word pattern echo from her television speakers, and both of her hands instinctively pressed down incredibly hard against her own kneecaps. The physical pressing was entirely involuntary, a primal somatic response executing before her conscious mind could even intervene exactly the way a human hand instinctively clamps down over a bleeding wound, long before the brain has fully assessed the extent of the catastrophic damage. Pattern, that was the exact word. It was the heavy, suffocating word she had been quietly carrying for 6 agonizing years. She had carried it through the sickening discovery of the spray paint, through the futile filing of the police report, through the terrified, hushed phone calls from her deeply worried daughter, and through the quiet, grinding, daily awareness that the very woman legally elected to represent her in the United States Congress had repeatedly broadcast things that actively made strangers want to paint hateful, violent symbols on her neighborhood window. And yet, for 6 long years, she had never heard a single person correctly identify it on a national screen. It was not framed as a simple mistake. It was not dismissed as a quote taken out of context. It was not shielded as a poor word choice. It was undeniably a pattern. She sat completely still with that profound realization, absorbing it the exact same way a patient sits with a devastating medical diagnosis they have secretly suspected for years, but have never actually heard spoken aloud by someone wielding the legitimate authority to officially name the disease. The hearing, however, was far from over. Rubio's voice underwent a drastic, chilling shift in register. It did not grow louder. Rather, it dropped significantly lower, tuning into the grim, solemn frequency a leader adopts when the subject matter transitions from abstract political theory to a catastrophic, literal body count. He directed the chamber's attention to the 23rd of March, 2019, specifically a high-profile care event. He confronted her with the reality that she had publicly described the horrific September 11th terrorist attacks, the calculated, brutal murder of 2,977 innocent Americans on sovereign American soil, with 4 devastatingly flippant words. He read the quote directly from the transcript. CARE was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something and that as a result, all of us were starting to lose vital access to our civil liberties. Omar immediately went on the defensive, her voice climbing in pitch, tightening dangerously the way a steel wire strains under an unbearable, snapping load. She aggressively accused him of deliberately taking her words out of context, recycling the same defense she had utilized for 6 years. But Rubio countered instantly, informing her that he had just read the complete, unedited context and the horrific reality of that full context, he pointed out, was that she had structurally reduced the September 11th attacks to a mere subordinate clause. In her framing, the terrorists were merely some people who did something, while the true tragedy, the actual subject of her sentence, was the subsequent loss of civil liberties. He forcefully reminded her that the 2,977 human beings who were viciously murdered that morning were entirely erased as the subject of her sentence. When she began to protest, loudly insisting that she would not be lectured about those 2,977 people, Rubio's voice did not attempt to shout over hers. Instead, it dropped completely beneath hers, moving with the unstoppable, crushing force of a lethal undercurrent dragging beneath a crashing surface wave. He relentlessly corrected her vocabulary. They were not just some people. They were 2,977 specific individuals with names. They were fathers who kissed their families, went to work that clear blue morning, and never came home. They were trapped mothers who made desperate final phone calls from smoke-filled stairwells just to say goodbye. There were fiercely brave firefighters who charged up 70 flights of burning stairs while every single rational human instinct told everyone else to run down. And she, a sitting member of Congress, had possessed the audacity to summarize their horrific slaughter as simply something. He stopped reading. His hands finally came to rest. His signature rapid-fire pace, the seamless bridging two languages velocity that had defined his entire political career, slowed dramatically to a haunting cadence the room had never witnessed before. It sounded less like a man arguing a political point and far more like a man overwhelmed by a vivid, traumatic memory. He looked directly at the Congresswoman and offered a deeply personal truth he had never before shared on the public stage. The polished, debate stage version of Marco Rubio vanished completely. What remained in that heavy silence was just a vulnerable man sitting at a kitchen table recounting a scar. He transported the silent room back to the 11th of September 2001. He was just 17 years old, sitting in a high school classroom in Miami when the horrific news broke that the second commercial plane had violently impacted the South Tower. He recalled a teenage girl sitting next to him, a girl named Anna, who immediately began sobbing uncontrollably. She was not crying because she personally knew anyone trapped inside those burning steel towers. She was weeping because, even at 17, she fundamentally understood that the safety of the entire world had just been shattered into a million pieces, and that it would never, ever be put back together the same way again. That, Rubio declared, looking straight through Omar's facade, was the profound, irreconcilable difference between her refugee story and his own. The defining metric was not the geographic coordinates of where they came from. The true measure was exactly what they chose to do and the respect they chose to show after they had safely arrived here. Omar opened her mouth to mount a counter-offensive. She desperately reached for her most reliable phrase, the safe harbor she had deployed throughout her entire career, beginning to declare that she had spent her life fighting for the people of my district. But the sentence withered and died in her throat. Rachel Abramson was undeniably one of the people of her district, and Rachel Abramson's storefront window had been violently defaced the exact week after her tweet. The hollow sentence knew exactly where it was heading, and it abruptly stopped. She tried a second tactical retreat, beginning to claim her statements had been taken out of context. But that attempt suffered the exact same devastating death as the first. Rubio had just methodically read the full, unabridged context into the congressional record, and the horrifying truth was that the full context was infinitely worse than the viral clip. The out-of-context defense was a rusty key that suddenly no longer fit the political lock she had been effortlessly turning for 6 years. Defeated, her chin dropped a quarter of an inch, the precise universal distance between a person who commands the room and a person who has just been thoroughly dismantled. Her hands retreated from their perfect geometric arrangement, slipping completely off the polished table and into her lap, entirely out of view. The impenetrable identity shield she had successfully weaponized against every probing journalist, every hostile committee, and every ethics investigation utterly failed to materialize because every single piece of evidence laid bare on the table consisted exclusively of her own quoted words, and a politician cannot logically accuse their own exact quotes of being Islamophobic. Stripped of all her defenses, she offered just 6 hollow words. I have nothing further to add. There was no righteous fire left, no protective shield remaining. The chamber was left with nothing but the deafening quiet of a woman who had confidently swaggered into a congressional hearing room armed with one triumphant narrative about herself, only to be forced to leave with a completely different, devastatingly accurate one, a narrative written entirely in her own handwriting, printed across 4 undeniable pieces of paper. 3 statements she had proudly kept, and 1 statement she had desperately tried to erase. The ensuing fallout was absolutely seismic. The video clip of the confrontation violently shattered the internet, racking up an astonishing 40 million views in a mere 72 hours. The political ecosystem initially dubbed it The Words, the condensed, hyperviral version showcasing Rubio methodically reading the deleted tweet, juxtaposed with the visceral imagery of Omar's hand trembling as it reached for the table and pulled back. The devastating realization that hatred is a better business model than honesty circulated with the unstoppable velocity of a revelation that isn't necessarily new information, but finally provides the perfect, lethal new language to describe a very old, deeply entrenched corruption. Within 48 hours, 3 separate House Democrats felt compelled to release official statements distancing themselves, and the notoriously sluggish House Ethics Committee immediately opened a preliminary review into the matter. The hashtag Delivery Boy trended furiously for a single day, but was swiftly and permanently eclipsed by the words, which dominated the geopolitical conversation for a full week. The fleeting insult was merely about Rubio, but the concrete evidence was entirely about Omar. And in the brutal arena of public opinion, empirical evidence always outlasts cheap insults the exact same way deep, fortified foundations outlast violent passing storms. That evening, back in the quiet isolation of Minneapolis, Rachel Abramson finally turned off her glowing television set. She picked up her phone and dialed her daughter Sarah, who lived in Chicago. Sarah answered on the second ring, already knowing. "You watching?" Rachel asked. "I watched," Sarah replied softly. "He talked about the window, Sarah," Rachel whispered. "Not my name, but the window." A profound silence fell over the line, the specific, heavy silence shared exclusively between 2 women who have been forced to have this exact agonizing conversation their entire lives in hushed kitchens, on late-night phone calls, and in the devastating pauses between asking, "Did you see what she said?" and the inevitable exhausted reply, "Yes, I saw." They did not need to articulate the silence, because the silence itself was the entire conversation. "She's my congresswoman, Sarah," Rachel murmured. "I know, Mom," Sarah replied. Rachel gently placed the phone down on the side table. She turned away from the black mirror of the television and looked directly at her actual window, the glass pane facing Nicollet Avenue that had been vandalized with hate 6 years prior by a coward who was never apprehended and scrubbed clean by a worker who never asked questions. The glass was perfectly clear now, but Rachel could still vividly see exactly where the thick red paint had been. The exact same way a person can clearly see an indelible watermark on paper long after it is completely dried, or the way a victim can still acutely feel the phantom ache of a deep bruise long after the purple color has entirely faded from their skin. With a heavy sigh, she reached out and pulled the curtains tightly closed. Meanwhile, in Miami, Marco Rubio picked up the phone to call his wife, Jeanette. He didn't want to talk about the viral metrics, the shifting political polls, or the intense drama of the hearing itself. Instead, he wanted to talk about his mother. He spoke of the Rooney Plaza, the endless stacks of towels, and the wealthy guests who threw casual thank yous into the air without ever once bothering to look up and make eye contact with the woman serving them. "She would have been horrified," he admitted softly. Jeanette's response was fierce and grounded. "Marco, your mama came to this country with absolutely nothing, and she thanked America every single day of her life," she reminded him. "That woman came here with nothing, and she called it hypnotized." And back in the suffocating quiet of Washington, D.C., Ilhan Omar sat alone at her sleek kitchen table, Her phone was flipped face down, actively ignoring the incessant buzzing of the political fallout. Glowing brightly on her open laptop screen were 4 distinct screenshots. 3 were the statements she had fiercely stood by, the statements that had built her brand. But it was the 4th screenshot, the one she had actively deleted, that completely held her gaze. It read, "Israel has a right to defend itself. The loss of life in Palestine is a tragedy, but context matters." She vividly remembered the exact moment she had written it. She remembered sitting in her old apartment in Minneapolis, enveloped in the quiet, producing an honest, nuanced thought that translated into an honest, compassionate sentence. That was long before the relentless demands of the national campaign, before the high-profile events, and before she was consumed by the insatiable political machine that ruthlessly converts careful, nuanced thinking into inflammatory content, turns that content into massive waves of donations, and ultimately morphs those donations into a deeply cynical version of herself that she had never originally planned to become, but crucially, had never actively refused to become either. She had genuinely believed that deleted sentence when she first typed it. She believed it with the profound conviction of a person who has arrived at a truth through agonizing intellectual thought rather than through cheap performative theater. And then she had consciously chosen to hit delete. She erased it because the honest, nuanced version of reality simply was not the version that won the furious online battles. She stared at the 4 printouts that had just dismantled her career on live television. 3 she kept, 1 she erased. And the haunting, inescapable truth radiating from the glowing screen was that the single thing she had chosen to erase was, in fact, the absolute truest thing she had ever written in her life. She kept the 3 statements that fueled the outrage machine, and she deleted the only one that dared to defend Israel, simply because compassion didn't successfully fundraise. She had possessed the sheer audacity to look the Secretary of State dead in the eye and brand the son of a maid a delivery boy, while actively suppressing her own humanity for profit. As the digital metrics continued to skyrocket and the geopolitical foundations began to permanently shift beneath her feet, a final, chilling broadcast prompt flickered across the screen, demanding the audience subscribe, leave exactly 1 word in the sprawling comment section below, and immediately share the damning footage with absolutely anyone who remembers the morning of September 11th as something far more significant than just something, because the world, no matter how broken, still demands to hear the truth spoken correctly, and the true cost of her deleted conscience was only just beginning to be calculated.